The security challenges we face today are more complex, less predictable, and faster evolving than at any point in recent history. For those who don't know, when I'm not the creator and host of the Jedburgh podcast and doing leadership development, I run a security company. Each year, I go down to the Global Security Exchange. This year, I had a chance to sit down with International SOS, the global leader in health and security services. They care for over 9,000 organizations in 1,000 locations across 90 countries. They field over 11,000 calls for assistance each day. To dig deep on today's global threats, I asked 3 of their senior leaders to sit down with me from the trade show floor in their booth. Sally Llewellyn is the Global Security Director of Information and Analysis. Kelly Johnstone served as the Chief Security Officer at Coca-Cola after a career at NCIS in Customs and Border Patrol. Dr. Mark Fischer is the Regional Medical Director for the Americas. Sally, Kelly, Mark, and I go deep on intelligence and why it's so important in the decision-making process for executives of any organization. We define duty of care and how it's evolved as we've transitioned from workplace to remote work. We also explain the importance of developing networks of influence, whether that be for intelligence to understand what's happening or medical support to help people in their time of need. Finally, we break down the roles of the Chief Security Officer and analyst and how the information they provide to decision makers is critical for the resiliency of an organization. The world is evolving faster than ever. It seems to change on a minute-by-minute basis. Our job as leaders is to understand what's happening out there, how it affects our people and our business, and then make decisions and bring in the resources that keeps us successful no matter the challenge. Kelly, Sally, Mark, welcome to the Jedburgh podcast.
Glad to be here.
Great to be here.
Oh, well, we're back in the International SOS booth. I just posted on Instagram, which is like often hard for me because I don't get social media that often. And I'm going to bring that up with you specifically, Sally, about social media, okay? But second year in a row. We're at GSX. Last year we were in Atlanta. This year we're here in Dallas. The show is way busier and way bigger than it was last year. Or really thought of, I'll put it that way, because they've always been there. And now they take the front page above the fold line in all of our newspapers and on our news every day. And I want to get into it with each one of you because we're going to talk about medical, we're going to talk about intel, and we're going to talk about your experience, Kelly, leading a global organization and how you tie all these things together.
Great.
Excellent. Well, we got to start with each one of you, all right? So, Kelly, let's start with you. You joined International SOS, about a year plus ago?
About 2 years, yeah.
And coming off a 20-plus year career at Coca-Cola where you were the Chief Security Officer. I'm envious. Absolutely incredible organization. You talk about, and prior to that, you served as a special agent in a variety of different organizations, including the FDA and Customs and Border Patrol and NCIS. So talk about that trajectory for a couple of minutes. Why security, and how cool was it to be the CSO of Coca-Cola?
So now that you know I'm 100 years old, security was something that I didn't choose. It almost chose me because I was going to be a lawyer and I wasn't ready to go to law school. And I took a little break, and my dad was in the Navy. We lived on a military base, so I walked down to the NCIS office and said, "Hey, I want to be an agent." And they're like, "Well, why would we hire you? You're just going to have a baby in a couple years." And I'm like, "I swear, I'm not going to have a baby in a couple years. Hire me." And they did. And every time I thought about going to law school, I thought about giving up this career in law enforcement that I just absolutely loved. And so I did transition to other agencies, kind of went from foreign counterintelligence and then got into drugs and did the border drugs with Customs. And that was great. Then went to FDA and did more doctors and pharmaceuticals and things like that. Met the Coca-Cola company doing a case for them and had a relationship with them. And eventually when I was ready to leave the government, I went to work for them. And I was with them for 20 years and eventually became the chief security officer. And it is probably the best company that I think is out there. I haven't worked for a lot of them, but since I've retired, I've had some involvement with other companies, and it's just reinforced how I feel about that company. But it's a huge company. We're in over 200 countries.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot going on. And much to what you were saying about the threat, the threats we're looking at today, there are some similar ones, but there are other things that are just so much more difficult to predict, which makes it even harder. And so the job was time consuming, but great.
And there's real decisions that you have to make. And so often those decisions as a chief security officer, as an executive in any organization, but especially a company that's in 200 places across the world, they're dynamic and different in every region of the world, which is why I want to get into Intel. Okay. And Sally, you are leading the Intel division here at International SOS. You come from a background of intelligence as an intelligence officer in the Australian military. But talk for a minute about the importance of Intel and why is it such a tool that is critical for decision makers in and out of the security organization to understand what's going on, where they have people?
Yeah.
And why'd you get into it?
Well, if I start with why I got into it, I mean, the reason I started all of this was I just wanted someone to pay me to travel. That was my goal in life. When I went up through university, it was like, what am I going to do that is get me out there in the world? I have 100% achieved that mission. But along the way...
you're also living in Dubai.
This is true. But along the way, I joined the Department of Defense in Australia, and they put us very rapidly through intelligence testing to find out, do you have the skill set to help solve complex problems and provide advice to leaders around how to make great decisions to keep their people safe? And I passed those tests, and that was the beginning of my career. Now, today, I have the opportunity to do that at International SOS, and my team's goal is very quickly, as fast as we can, understand what's going on in the world, share that information with our clients, and share the advice around actions that they can take to keep their people safe, yes, but also to keep their operations going in really complex places around the world. And we're a fantastic business enabler as well as helping to manage risk. And my team does that on a 24/7 basis, just trying to understand what's going on in the world, what might happen next, what does the next 12, 24 hours look like, what does the week ahead look like, to try and inform really good decision making. That's the goal.
Yeah. And so often when we look at these, the Intel picture, we got to talk about the effect of the medical situation for our people all across the world. Dr. Mark Fischer, you lead the Americas here with the medical response capability for International SOS. Talk about the importance of understanding medical capability all across the world, wherever we have people. And then I want to get into why you joined International SOS, but then also how do we develop a competent network of providers in so many regions of the world, and many of which we don't know that much about.
Right. Well, first, thanks for having us here today. And,
Absolutely.
And it's wonderful to be with my colleagues here. And being at GSX, security focus, I'm the token physician here. And what I think it stresses is the incredible importance and the interdependencies that medical and security have. Where there's a medical case, there's often security and vice versa. And what Sally mentioned before about enabling companies, protecting organizations and people is really what is key and what's goal here. And getting that intelligence really helps formulate mitigating risk, but we also know that mitigating risk doesn't eliminate risk. And so having that network of providers to understand what is going on locally. We're a global company with many of our, the people that we represent are traveling around the world, or they have organizations or, companies that are in different locations. It's important to understand those risks when we're providing advice. So my role as the Regional Medical Director of Assistance within the Americas is to say, from a physician with, from this side, with that lens, how does that care look around the world? And the intelligence is important about whether it's hurricanes that are coming up the coast, which may then absolute destroy hospitals within the Caribbean, and then what did the hospitals look like before, and then what does it look like now, to the infectious diseases that may come. And so all that stuff comes in, and we kind of collate the information and collect it and say, how are we able to protect our people?
There's a term that we use called duty of care. Used a lot in medical, but Kelly, you hear that a lot at the senior level leadership within organizations. Can you define duty of care, and why is that such an important concept for us to understand when we build and run organizations? Kelly?
Yeah, so when I think about duty of care, it's more of a legal definition for us. It's what the company's obligation is to protect people from, again, a foreseeable risk. Sometimes people think you should be protecting them from an unforeseeable risk, and then therein lies sometimes the interpretation. But when I think about duty of care these days, I think about the way duty of care has changed since COVID. Duty of care prior to COVID was what happens inside your building, inside your walls, and maybe if you're on travel. Now with the workplace boundaries kind of going away and people are working from home, maybe in London and an Airbnb, the duty of care has expanded and it's murkier. So if you're on a conference call in your car now, do I have a duty of care if you get in a car wreck? If you're at your house and you fall down the stairs, is that my duty of care responsibility because you have a home office now that you're working in 3 days a week? So duty of care has gotten really muddy and murky and more interpretive, and people are trying to figure out what it means now for us.
Is there an answer? Have we found the answer?
No, but I think you err on the side of caution. More is better than less. So if you say that's not my duty of care, so then again, it's opening up our responsibility to do more and more and more to protect more and more people in very different ways. And again, to your point, everything is different. And it's just more. It's just more.
It's an incredible challenge because you talk about being in 200 countries, right? I think about my time at Snap where we were in 26 cities and 19 countries, and you've got 4,000 or 5,000 employees.
Yeah.
But now, as you said, so am I now responsible for all of those offices, all of their travel, and 4,000 homes?
Yeah, you are. If something happens and they feel that you were responsible and they can prove it in court, there's your ultimate test of whether you were responsible. So let's not get there, and let's just do the right thing on the front end so we don't have to prove it in court whether we should have been responsible or not. So yeah, you do look at things very differently now than you used to, much more holistically.
So are we talking about like writing policies and giving guidance for...
We give a lot of guidance.
Workday at your house?
Yes. There's a lot of things looking at HR policies and different policies that had to change since COVID because of the way we're working now.
Wow.
Yeah.
Sally, what's your definition of duty of care?
It's an interesting one. I mean, every leader out there says their people are the most important thing. And without them, they cannot achieve any outcome in their business. So for me...
Fact, special operations truth number one, people are more important than hardware.
That is, so everyone has to have their employees performing at their best at all time to achieve their outcomes. So duty of care for me is the actual piece behind that grandiose statement at the top. So you care about your people, you care about their health, their well-being, their safety, wherever they are, wherever you're asking them to operate all around the world. And I agree with Kelly and with Mark. I mean, it's becoming even more complicated. The expectations of employees post-COVID, I feel, has definitely changed. The type of employees and the diversity of the employee population now in organizations, LGBTQ+ is the most at-risk group of people that any organization employs.
Why?
And that's just the nature of living in that community and certain places around the world and here in the US where it is more risky to be their full selves in that environment. So employers have a duty of care to provide understanding of the risk environment, ability to support if something goes wrong, confidential advice around how to manage your risk profile in any location. that is a requirement to fulfill both the moral duty of care obligation and also the legal one, depending on what market you're actually operating in.
If I could just give just a quick example of that. So you have a traveler from, LGBTQ plus, and they're going to a country where there was a conversation yesterday at one of the conferences here regarding travels and where it's illegal to be a part of that community travel. But there are locations where it is completely legal, but culturally it's not accepted. How does that impact the traveler from a medical perspective, a security perspective, from a mental well-being perspective? So that's understanding the information before you go in, the foreseeable risk. And then what are you going to do about it if something happens? Is there 24/7 assistance to be able to provide guidance, having a person navigate that situation and make sure that there's help, regardless if they want to provide consent to the company or not. So those are, I think, the key things. And doing the right thing, that duty of care, it has evolved, but it's something that you need to think about.
But there's also educating about it.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we got to start with the fact that we need our employees, we need our leaders first in our organizations to say we've got to proactively think about these things. And then we need our employees to say, okay, is this something that I'm comfortable doing, understanding the risk? Do they even know the risk? Right? And so there's a whole education piece around it.
And then there's one other piece is the confidentiality piece. So a lot of people, someone said the other day that my organization, there are 4, in the LGBTQ plus community. Oh no, there's probably way more. You just don't know about them. So you're traveling, you get into trouble, but no one even knows. You don't want to out yourself. What do? So those are solutions that have to be offered. International SOS does have a solution, which is great, but a lot of companies don't have solutions for that scenario.
The tagline of the podcast is how you prepare today determines success tomorrow. I know you all knew that because you spent all night last night preparing and listening to as many episodes as possible. But what I hear you each saying comes back to this idea of preparation, this thought process of what and how do we need to do things proactively in order to be ready when we face, you name it, situation. And so that what we'll talk about is response versus reaction. International SOS is an organization that's built on, I would say, response. Are we proactively thinking about all of these different things so that when it comes, we are responding, not reacting? I want to go there for a second with each of you from your own perspective in when you approach your role each day. And we'll start with Intel. Okay. How do you separate those two and move organizations into that response versus react mode?
So before I answer, one thing I would actually disagree with you about, you said International SOS is a response capability. I actually feel like International SOS spends more time planning and preparing for the response than we do responding.
Okay, all right, I'll give you that. That's what I'll say. That's what I meant.
that's what
I agree with Sally.
I can be corrected on my own
that's
show.
what you're getting at. So for my team, the message that I send them every day is 99% of the time, you will figure out the problem before it becomes a problem. You will see it. That's our job. So we are required to go out there looking for the issues that are going to impact our clients, but are also going to impact Mark's team, who's going to have to respond from a medical standpoint. So 24/7, we are continuously monitoring the risk environment in which we as an organization, we're in 1,000 locations around the world. There's a lot of places that we need to care about what's happening in that environment. Our clients are operating in even more. So continuously understanding what's happening in that risk environment, understanding when something's getting worse, what's that trajectory, what's the trend. So my team right now is looking at the immediate next 12, 24 hours, but I have another part of my team who's thinking about the next 12 to 18 months. What are the big ticket things that are going to happen over that period of time? We traditionally know election periods are higher risk in certain places around the world. We know hurricane season is going to impact the US and the Caribbean. We know the impacts of climate change across Asia are increasing the risk to our clients. So we are then informing the planning internally at International SOS, so our assistance centres are ready to respond. Our medical and security colleagues are working on what capability are they going to need on the ground in that location to be able to support. If I think back to the Ukraine example, 6 to 12 months out from the conflict, my team was saying we have a problem and this is going to potentially get bad. We looked at a range of scenarios.
We talked about it 10 years ago in special
Exactly.
forces.
Yeah, it's not a new problem. Looked at different scenarios as to how badly this could possibly go. And we sent a team on the ground ahead of time to ensure that we had the right capability in the right locations across Ukraine, that when that conflict happened, we were pretty rapidly able to turn around and start evacuating people out of the country. We were warning people to evacuate days before the conflict kicked off. So for us, the more energy and effort we can put into the planning and preparation, the better the outcomes are for us as a business, but also for our clients who are operating in those locations. So that is my focus 24 hours a day, is how do I get ahead of the next problem, which is hard to do given the scale of the problem today.
Well, and hope is not a course of action, right? Hopefully we'll figure it out when it happens is never going to be the answer. Immediately fire leaders who tell you that. Mark, from your perspective, when we talk about response, I asked it before in my long list of initial comments that I made to you, but I'll circle back because you didn't answer it, I noticed. When we talk about developing and preparing this response capability from a medical standpoint, there's austere regions all over the world. I spent 2 years of my career in special forces working in and around Africa. And we talk about, there's often not a hospital, as you mentioned. And if there is, it's not necessarily a hospital you want to go to, nor may there be a doctor that you want to talk to for anything. Even it might be a small cut that could be infected. When you look across the world and you take the data that's coming from Sally's team to understand the threat picture, and you're working with clients in all these regions, how are you vetting and identifying competent organizations that you can partner with to develop these capabilities?
Sure. So we have a team, network services team, which is global. There's 26 assistance centers around the world, and we leverage the expertise within those assistance centers that understands what's going on from the hospitals, local physicians, ground transportation like ambulances, pharmacies, vaccine, blood supply, etc. All that information is then brought together to a database that we're able to review that. We have over 100,000 providers, both medical, security, and teams are regularly going out there to be able to vet whether it's a desktop or actually going in there and visit the hospitals. It's incredibly important to have a medical person walk through the hospital. What's the ICU look like? Do they have ventilators? What's the radiology department?
Looking at it on a map and saying, well, the hospital's, a mile away from where we are, and then checking the box.
Exactly.
It's not.
Or you look at the website and they'll say they have these 30 specialists, but they may be visiting once a month. They're not there. And that information is incredibly important, because when I speak to the team, it's understanding what's going on there medically, and we oftentimes can optimize the care from the onset that prevents those evacuations. However, as you mentioned, there's some places that are incredibly austere, and if there are certain significant medical conditions or trauma, we know from the onset, let's get them evaluated locally, but I'm also, what's the closest airfield? What's the ability to get them out? And where's the nearest center for an upgrade in care? Because we know from the onset, the care is so poor that their ability to manage and to treat the condition is very, very limited. So that's what we do. And once again, we have a team. So the team that I are responsible are for the entire Americas region, where we're regularly going and vetting that for those providers, as well as air ambulance providers, my security colleagues, the security side as well.
And we're talking about it now in the context of remote areas, other countries, but these things evolve and change, and they evolve and change even here in the U.S.
Oh, absolutely.
You look at and how do even things like economic conditions. My son, a couple of months ago, he's 3, so if you have kids, you understand that they don't listen when you tell them to do certain things. And we're at dinner at a restaurant, and we're like, "Hey, stop jumping on the chair! Stop jumping on the chair!" Inevitably, he fell off the chair, and it was one of those like slow motion ones where every drink was taken down, and as he's laying on the ground, the drinks are just falling off onto him, and then There's the delayed screaming. Anyway, we go home, and I see him holding his arm, and he won't let go of his arm. He won't use his arm. And so naturally, I'm like, it'll be all right. A couple of hours later, it's still going on. So I said, well, I got to take him in. So there's 2 hospitals near where we live in Connecticut. One of them is a smaller regional hospital. The other one's a level 1 trauma center. And it's like 11 o'clock at night. Because these things never happen in the middle of the day, right? And I said, okay, well, if I go to the small regional hospital, they're probably going to be understaffed because there's a nursing shortage. But if I go to the level 1 trauma center, they're going to be staffed. Man, was I wrong. Because when I got home at 6 in the morning, all right, there was 1 ER doc at the level 1 trauma center. The other hospital, because then I did some due diligence on this to understand, well, if this ever happens again, they're actually staffed at like 95% capacity. So these are all things that even in our backyard, I mean, we're talking about, north of New York City, where you would expect there to be a highest concentration of these personnel, things like economic impact will affect how quickly you can be seen.
Right. So my son fell off the monkey bars many years ago and had a fracture of his arm in Connecticut and dealt with it. So I know firsthand what that's like. But imagine navigating that same situation, but now you're in a remote area of Honduras or a very far off place in Argentina or wherever that is.
And or Niger while the coup is going.
Exactly. And so, the question is from the security side, sometimes it's more unsafe to go from a safety and security perspective to the hospital at night rather than saying, let me get information, let's wait till the next morning, versus you need to go now. But ultimately, then what do you do next? Who's placing the guarantee of payment at the hospital? Are you fit to fly? All these things are something that we do. That's like a Wednesday for us. So that's something that we do every single day. Yeah.
Kelly, when you assess all of this, at a senior leadership level, and one of the primary jobs of the chief security officer is to serve as that advisor cut in an economic downturn, security and marketing.
Yeah.
So we feel good every night.
So there's a lot of parts to that answer. But, when I was listening to Sally and she was talking about all the things that they process on a daily basis, looking at risks and what's going to manifest today and what's coming over the horizon, that's basically what I have to do for the company and look at where we are and what we're going to do and what we're going to sell and where we're going to expand and who we're going to partner with and looking at all that stuff and trying to figure out what's going to cause us risk, what risk are we going to mitigate, what risk are we going to accept, what risk is intolerable. And then putting together the facts in a way that my leadership can make those decisions. They can say, okay, this risk we're going to accept, this risk we're going to mitigate. So Kelly, tell me how to mitigate it. Or maybe the lawyers mitigate it or finance mitigate it. Or maybe it's a different kind of risk that's not just a security risk, but it's still a risk and I can identify using the intelligence, because intelligence doesn't just serve you from a security perspective. Intelligence serves you from a business perspective. Yep. It's a business enabler. So,
well, that's what we're there to do at the end of the day. We got to be, and this is really important for people in organizations, whether they're employees, they're leaders, whether they're security professionals. Our job as security leaders is to not be an impediment to the business at the end of the day, because that's when we don't get funded, we get cut out, the meeting starts and we find that, hey, there's a meeting going on, why wasn't I invited? Really, at the end of the day, our job there is to ensure that the environment is conducive for the business to meet its business objectives.
And then you have to know what the business is, right? I hear so many security people say, I don't need to know what we're doing, I just need to... No, yeah, you do. Because if you don't know what's important to the business, you don't know how the business makes money, you don't know how the business is going to grow, you can't protect that growth, or you can't protect, what's happening to enable that growth. So you really have to look at it differently than just looking at security risks. It's all risk to the business. and then using our ability to critically think, analyze large masses of information, get all these different intelligence sources, and then process that in a manner that the company can make a decision. That's what I have to do by the end of the day on all these different areas.
And then you're a value-added resource.
And then you're a business enabler. Absolutely. And you get that seat at the table because we critically think differently than other people. And so don't call me after it all gets messed up. If I'm sitting at the table, I can help.
Yeah. But when they do call you, you still often become then that focal point to solve the problem.
And so many other problems that have nothing to do with security because they know you can solve a problem. You are the problem solver, so you get the call on everything.
Yeah, it's a really empowering and awesome experience to be in those roles.
When you get to the point where they trust you and your decisions and they want to hear what your opinions are, that's when you know you've done a good job.
Yeah.
Could I just add something to that? Because this week being here at GSX, I had an analyst come up to me from a different organization and said, I feel like no decision maker is listening to me when I'm telling them that there's a problem and I'm preparing my assessment. I'm explaining to them I don't feel like anyone's listening. And I said, how much time have you spent to understand the decision makers? What are they responsible for? What's the business doing? Where are they going? What's the decision-making cycle? At what point is your analysis relevant? If you haven't spent the time to do that, no one's ever going to listen. You'll be an analyst off in the corner, which is easy to ignore and potentially, as Kelly said, easy to cut. So as analysts, we have to spend a lot of time understanding who are we speaking to? What are the decisions that they're making? What are they responsible for? We spend a lot of time doing that at International SOS. How much can we understand about the different clients that we support so that we're actually giving them something that's valuable and relevant and actionable?
Well, that's the term an analyst. Analysis. Analysis is not report generation, right? I don't need my intelligence analyst to tell me what's going on in the news. I can watch the news or read the newspaper. What I need them to tell me is, why did this event that happened in this location, how does it affect me?
Mm-hmm. Why is it important?
Why do I need to know that information, and what decisions now do I need to make based on that information? That's the analysis. So yeah, I would say your response is spot on. And then you can ask that analyst the question, are you a reporter or an analyst? And think about that. I want to go around for a second, and I want to ask you what you see as the biggest threats right now. Because we've thrown out a lot in this conversation. We opened it up with, the world has changed dramatically in the last year, and we talked about terrorism and geopolitical risk and nation state on nation state yesterday. Now we'll date it because this won't come out for a bit, but yesterday, Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un met. Okay, and this is a significant event. President George Bush was here yesterday. We all sat in on his talk, and he spoke very vehemently about the need to seriously understand what's going on in the world, and America has to stand up with a new generation of leaders, and we have to stand at the top of the world order again, and we cannot be a passenger as the world order changes. I've spoken about that with Newt Gingrich and a number of other senior leaders. When you assess the world right now, what's your biggest risk that you see?
So let me start, because mine's going to be probably very different from theirs. All of those are important. From the Coca-Cola perspective, we operate in all those countries. So it's very critical to us what's going on in all these different countries all over the world, and the relationships between U.S. companies and our presence in other parts of the world. So all that stuff is important. From a chief security officer perspective, from a security industry perspective right now, what's hardest is the unpredictableness of all of these different security situations going on. In the past, we use intelligence to look at trends and history and kind of try to make analysis of how we need to get ahead of these risks. And so they were more predictable. We're going to have a hurricane. We have terrorists out there. How do we harden our stuff? Predictable, able to mitigate, go forward, educate. Now it's like we have people who are polarized and can't even talk to each other. And so you have people reacting in a very aggressive manner. And in the United States, we have places that people can't travel to. None of this stuff happened. The unpredictability of these threats now makes it harder for us to mitigate and get ahead of them. And so it's harder to tell our people what to do because we just sometimes aren't expecting what's happening. It's just so unpredictable. People are acting in ways that we're not used to seeing people act, and it makes it harder to get ahead. And so all of these things are important, but the unpredictableness of it makes it even more difficult to manage and try to stay ahead of. And that's kind of the biggest thing for me. If I was thinking about how I was going to protect Coke, it's a little more complicated.
Yeah. It's going to require us to be more proactive in our thought process.
And more way looking out like in left field, like to things we never thought would happen. Now let's think about that. Are we going to be a business that can't operate in China in the future? Let's think about that so we're not shocked if it happens. We wouldn't have thought about that 10 years ago. So those are the kinds of things we have to try to get ahead of that are so different than we've ever tried to get ahead of.
Sally?
I mean, I could talk about this topic all day. So let me try and, this is what I do. Yeah. So let me try and, let me try and be finite about what it is. I think you mentioned a lot, geopolitical risk, and that has definitely changed in the last couple of years. I mean, the Russia-Ukraine conflict changed the game in terms of what we could potentially see in terms of geopolitics. And Kelly hit on a really important point around geopolitics. You see, for us, the immediate risk of a conflict. We saw that in Ukraine, and that's the extreme end of what you can see from a security standpoint. We had clients impacted all over the world by sanctions and by food availability and flight diversions, and it's those other pieces that impact business beyond those who were immediately impacted on the ground. So if I think about all the geopolitical shifts, I think about the complexity of organizations operating in a sanctions compliance environment, which is much beyond that immediate security piece. The other things I'll touch on quickly, natural disasters, that would be, I'm shocked every day that is probably the number one thing. I mean, Mark will say his sort of number one, but if I think about breadth of client impact globally, it's natural disaster and response.
Well, the unpredictable nature of natural disasters that Kelly's talking about. I mean, just think about the last couple of weeks, fires in resort town of Maui, and then we saw last week the earthquake in Morocco, and
exactly.
I think we got lucky this week with this hurricane coming up the coast is going to go. I mean, northern Newfoundland is getting a hurricane.
Yeah.
When was the last time that happened?
Yeah.
Well, and the floods that they're now saying were really a hurricane.
Yeah.
When did you have a hurricane over there?
And Los Angeles and Southern California had a hurricane and an earthquake at the same time.
Yeah. My team.
I lived in California, so we know they couldn't handle it.
My team today is dealing with the dam breach in Libya. We have a lot of clients impacted by that situation.
I saw that.
A lot of people don't realize just how many organizations are still operating in a place like Libya. I do want to mention terrorism. I'll be brief. We haven't seen the impact of Afghanistan yet. There's an increase in militancy activity in Pakistan that we're nervous about. And then the complexity of the drawdown of NATO forces out of the Sahel, Wagner operations. I don't think we've yet seen the kind of mid to longer term impact of those changes. And the other one is information and polarization, politicization of information, the future role of AI and how fast the space is moving from an information overload standpoint. These are some of the things that I grapple with every day around being worried about the risk environment going forward.
I told you I was going to ask you about social media really quickly. How has social media and this transition, this digitization of the media cycle, the news cycle, because it's instantaneous now and it's unchecked, how has that changed the threat landscape?
So to age myself,
we could have a whole
that's a whole nother podcast.
The 30-second version.
To age myself, I was an analyst before social media, and so when I look at my team,
I was studying journalism when you still reported the facts.
I was an agent before we had cell phones, guys.
So when I look at the team today and just how fast moving information is and how the breadth of what is available, I mean, we use some incredible AI tools, which I think are a huge benefit in terms of just getting across such a breadth of information that there's no way a human brain can kind of process all of that. That is extremely helpful. The negative impact of that is you don't know the reliability of that source potentially. And there is so much mis and disinformation out there that it's very, very difficult to understand, am I getting something factual, or am I getting a bot, or am I getting a politicized version of a real situation? And we have definite examples of that in the US, of course. We see it in Russia. We see it all over the world. And trying to get to the factual base of that, verification is taking longer than it used to take. And it's really important for us to provide our clients with verified information that they can trust. That's part of the value of what we provide, because we know they're making real world life decisions based on the information that we're providing. So there's a positive and a negative to just how fast the kind of social media landscape is moving.
On my end, I'm getting the phone call from my CEO saying, I saw this thing, tell me what's going on. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't know. But then even the people I rely on to tell me the reliability of that, it's taking longer. And so everything is just slowing down, and slowing down is not a good thing in the business world. So it makes it more difficult.
Yeah. Mark?
Yeah, so I think the biggest risk, all these points that you guys discuss, I think are incredibly important. From my perspective, and this could be a long conversation as well, but I think it's organizations being resilient. And if you're not being resilient, things continue to evolve. That's where you're at risk. So we talked about preparing, having a plan, understanding what happens when you're there, but things continually to change, whether it's because of weather disturbances, terrorism, new infectious disease, anything. Things occur, and they happen throughout the fiscal year for different organizations. Being resilient, having places to who can you contact to get that information, verify the information, and what do you do with the information? So what? Yeah. I think that and being okay to say, this was our initial plan, this was our SOP, that needs to change a bit. So the resiliency, I think, is incredibly important there.
Well, of all places in the world where you're going to get to experience everything out there when we talk about security, this is the place at GSX. Because you can walk this floor and you can see absolutely everything that's out there. Next year, it's in Orlando. So I'm looking forward to that. I sincerely appreciate all of your time this morning. I know it was an early morning on day 3 of GSX, but it's wrapping up over here in the next couple of days, and everyone's going their separate ways. So thankful for everything that you're doing in each of your respective roles, what International SOS is doing for the broader community, the value that they're bringing to organizations. And it's incumbent upon all of us as security leaders to continue that message that President Bush talked about yesterday, and that is that we have to think about the reality of what the world brings to us every day. We don't live in a world of hopefully, like I mentioned before, nothing will happen. It is going to happen. Are we going to be ready when it happens? And are we going to be ready across the full spectrum of everything that our organization does? Because even though we classify risk, at the end of the day, it's incumbent upon us to make sure that all of those risks are mitigated as best we can, and we protect people, property, brand, reputation.
And, to add to what you're saying, a lot of times when it's mitigated properly, then people say, oh, it's no longer a risk, and they take the funding and take away the mitigation, and then it pops up, and everyone's like, what happened?
Yeah.
Because you stopped mitigating it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Can't wait till next year.
Yeah, it was great. Thanks.
Thanks very much.
All right. American Jedburghs went out to form the foundation of the United States Special Forces and the Special Activities Directorate of the Central Intelligence Agency. Thanks for listening to the Jedburgh Podcast. I'm your creator and host, Fran Rachopi. Join us next week for a new episode on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Check us out on YouTube for full episodes, highlights, and other behind-the-scenes content. If you like what you heard, give us a like and leave a review. Follow me, Fran Rachopi, Jesse Graff, Talent War Group, and our CrossFit Games sponsors, U.S. Army, Wodify, GoRuck, and Hero Coffee on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, Threads, or X. Send your comments and inquiries to fran@jedburghpodcast.com. As a former member of Special Forces, the Jedburgh Podcast donates a percentage of all proceeds to the Green Beret Foundation, supporting America's Special Forces and their families. Thanks for joining us on this episode. How you prepare today determines success tomorrow.